Hello, many of you are reaching out to me regarding the crash of the Caravelle Ajaccio-Nice. It was on September 11, 1968, and it's also known as Air France Flight 1611. Usually we just say the Ajaccio-Nice flight and everyone knows what we mean. It's a very old flight, but it still raises questions and even passions. Today, we'll review it again for this reason. It's because the justice system in France has decided to launch new investigations in addition to those that took place at the time of the accident. Other searches in the region, right, off the coast of Nice to try to photograph or even potentially recover pieces of debris. Example, searches will take place towards the end of this year, and also depending on what they can find or not, they will also take place next year in 2026. So what is it really about, it seems to me? September 11, 1968, in the morning at Ajaccio Airport, there's a plane, it's a twin-engine Caravelle SE 210 from SUD Aviation. And actually, this plane will take off around 10 in the morning, 10:09. And actually, on board, there are 95 people. It's a twin-engine public transport plane on a short flight that day. We're talking about roughly 250 kilometers then. The aircraft takes off, so normally what's planned is that the aircraft takes off, arrives, it took off heading south, runway 21. He had to change the QFE today because there's a constant shift of the Earth's magnetic pole, which means that runways regularly change their numbers. Because they're oriented, they're calculated or based on magnetic north, if you will. In any case, our plane was supposed to take off more or less towards the south, right? Then head back up north. It reaches a cruising altitude of 16,000 feet or level 160, which isn't very high. It stays there for 5-6 minutes and then starts its descent again towards Nice Airport. So these are extremely short flights that start and end within the hour, literally, or within half an hour, for this one in particular. And these are pretty tough flights for the pilots. That is to say, there are a lot of things happening one after another. Takeoff, then climb, preparation for landing, and also switching from one controller to another. So often on these flights, the landing briefing for Nice is actually done even before the injection takeoff. So just to tell you, it's a routine flight, a regular route, but at the same time, it's quite a flight. There's a lot of pressure on the pilots, so everything seems to be going as normally as possible. The aircraft at a certain point is descending. It's estimated that it was roughly between flight level 90 and 70, so it had already lost half of its cruising altitude. And then suddenly the pilot contacts the controller in Nice saying, "I've got trouble, that's it, I've got trouble." And then the controller in Nice responds to him. The pilot says, "I want to land in Nice or wherever you want. I mean, just do something, give me vectors, something. I want to land as quickly as possible." So the controller tells him to descend to 2,000 feet, so he does. By telling him that he has full authority to act as he wishes, so he gives him complete freedom of action. He understands this is an emergency. The captain will respond by saying, "We have a fire, there is a fire on board." That's information communicated over the frequency. Afterwards, he adds something like, "We're going to crash if this continues," or "We're going to go down if this continues." And actually, that was the last message received. So the controller in Nice will, for several minutes, keep sending messages, but he won't get any response. And the plane had actually already disappeared from the radar. And later in the day, around noon, they will start to find floating objects. They'll find oil slicks drifting with their characteristic sheen on the ocean. So the flight had crashed, killing everyone on board, 95 people. You need to know one thing before thinking about this accident. We're going to try to look at 2 or 3 theories. You need to know one important thing. We don't think about accidents from the 60s with today's mentality. Back then, just to give you a number, if you look at the Caravelle, if you look at the Boeing 707, the Douglas Commercial 8, even the Comet, the planes from the 50s and 60s, What you'll notice is that the accident rate was very high. That means literally, right? Literally, we had about roughly a quarter of the airliners that were being manufactured. They crashed one way or another, sometimes with casualties, sometimes not, but were destroyed. The first generation of jets had many accidents. In '68, the 737 still hadn't arrived. All right, just so you know, huh? So it was still a time when aviation had a different face. And what if we hadn't realized the danger, if we hadn't fundamentally changed aviation? Whether it's the design of airplanes, pilot training, or the management of air campaigns, if this hadn't been changed, and partly thanks to the initiatives of the AFA in the United States, many safety-related initiatives, fire standards and studies on CIFIT ground proximity warning system and other equipment requirements all originate from the AFA in the United States. Small improvements against impacts, against mid-air collisions, the planes involved also come from the AFA. So honestly, without that, I can tell you that today, aviation would have died out on its own. Because it would be unacceptable in our time, wouldn't it, to have that accident rate? But in any case, if we go back to those times, it was something, let's say, quite common. First, second, if we look at the statistics, the Caravelle, roughly speaking, 26 of the Caravelles that were built ended up wrecked. Well, regarding the accidents, about 10 of the Caravelle accidents were related to fires on board. On other aircraft, fires were less frequent. Just to give you an idea, since we're talking about numbers today, it was well below 1 less than 0.5. Airliners that are built end up damaged in one way or another. An accident or something similar, right? Yes, the proportion has nothing to do with the time period. Let's return to our story about the Caravelle. Rescue efforts start, but nothing more can be done for the people. Some debris has been recovered, but most remains at about 2,300 meters. We're about 22,000 nautical miles off the coast of Nice. And then you have to use cable layers and all that, and literally go retrieve or scrape the seabed to try to recover whatever can be recovered. So we discover that the plane is very fragmented, meaning it hit the water after the last communication with the pilots, probably a minute and a half after the last communication. When the captain says we'll crash if this continues, the plane must have flown for 1 to 1.5 minutes by then. Because it disappears from the radar afterward, it's very difficult to estimate the exact moment. I'll give you a detail. The radars don't constantly see. At 360 degrees, they sweep instead. So there's an antenna that rotates and refreshes the screen, so a plane will simply disappear at a certain point. It's there at the next refresh, then it disappears, so it vanished between the two refreshes, but we can't know exactly at which second. So as I was saying, and that's a roll, maybe for later, I was saying that when they bring up what they can, the device is heavy. I don't have the Caravelle's documentation, but if you consider it on the ground without passengers, fuel, or anything else, we're talking about a machine that's just under 40 tons. I'd bet it's between 37 and 38 tons, roughly speaking. In terms of debris in the water, we collect between 8 and 10 tons of debris. So we've collected that. Let's say roughly about a quarter of the plane, so 3/4 remain. We can still feel it underwater. That's why the search is ongoing today. So what are we going to find in there? Well, we're actually going to find traces of fire. So the pilot wasn't imagining it. There really was a fire. That means if we look, for example, at the seat trims, the armrests, the tray tables, all of that, we will find that there is an important part that has traces of soot or signs of exposure to heat. So most of these elements, in fact, all of these elements exposed to fire are located at the rear of the plane, towards the front of the plane. No part was exposed to fire or heat. In the cargo holds, it's the same. In the cargo holds, there is nothing in the recovered luggage and so on. There is nothing that indicates the fire started in the cargo holds. So we're dealing with a fire that was at the back and inside the cabin, potentially also outside. But once again, we don't have all the details yet. Well, they'll find out. They'll find out. So they're going to track it a bit, try to see which parts were exposed to the highest heat. So what they deduce, because they run tests, like if they find a plastic panel with a particular discoloration, for example, it's yellowed in a certain spot. What are they going to do? They'll take the same one or a similar one and they'll start exposing it to fire at different temperatures in different conditions to try to see what temperatures produce about the same discoloration. So that gives them a little idea. For example, they find a rug, a floor mat. It has a core, a metal frame. The rest is plastic. The plastic has partially melted, so they say to themselves, okay, what temperature is needed to destroy the plastic? What do we notice at this point? But at the same time, the internal frame remains more or less intact. So that gives a minimum, a maximum temperature, and so on. They gradually manage to get an idea of the thing. What they notice is that there was a fire. Yes, this fire corresponds to a sudden burst of strong flames inside the plane. See, what the report says is that it was a brief occurrence. It's as if there was some kind of flash inside the plane, and then it will, of course, destroy a number of elements inside. But they can't find any elements that were exposed to extreme temperatures. We're talking about several hundred degrees. Whereas in other incidents, like we've seen in Yemen on this channel, you can see we've seen temperatures, especially those fueled by fuel, that rise very quickly. There's something you need to know. I'll just show you an example here of a plane. It's a Douglas commercial, 10-in planes. You have engines that can be in two places. This one's interesting because they appear in both spots, under the wings or at the tail, as shown here. The Caravelle has two engines at the tail. It's a bit like the same system as the Douglas commercial, 9, for example. And actually what happens is that the engines that are under the wings get their fuel directly from the wings. Is typically the fuel in the wings, and then it will be pumped to the engine. That's simple. When you have engines at the back, the fuel always comes from the wings. It comes from the central tank, and actually you have to bring it to the back. So what we have fuel pipes. We have fuel pipes that will go up somewhere. So they can go up along the floor, they can go up somewhere and go all the way to feed the engines. So there's this requirement, isn't there, to run piping all along the fuselage, all along the airframe, and that doesn't exist. In planes with engines under the wings, there's no need to run fuel all over the place. So clothing, what is it? What does the accident report say? What does the accident report retain? So they're going to evaluate several possibilities, aren't they? With, of course, the methods of the time, with the means of the time, and in particular, the means of that era. It's a black box that's already partially damaged. So that means the last flight isn't readable. That's both the first and second point. It doesn't have many parameters. These are typically boxes with 4 or 5 parameters. You have the heading, altitude, acceleration, and time. That's it. We've already made the list. Actually, if you want, they themselves admit in their report that if the black box hadn't been damaged, it still wouldn't have revealed the origin of the fire. And here we have to agree with them because those values unfortunately wouldn't have changed anything about our understanding of this accident. So as I was saying, they're going to go through a lot of hypotheses. For example, one hypothesis that was evaluated is, what about the passengers, right? Will they flee the fire, escape the blaze, or move to the front of the plane? Causing a shift in balance, so a change in the center of gravity. And this could cause a loss of control of the plane, making it nosedive. They found that at the speeds the plane was flying, a deflection of just 3 degrees of the elevator surface would have been enough to balance all the passengers moving forward. Knowing that it has a deflection of 30 degrees, so you can see that it would have taken very, very little, a very small effort to compensate, for example, for the mass movement of the passengers. That alone couldn't explain the loss of control, since we're trying to understand why the pilots lost control. Especially since when there's an emergency, it happens suddenly. I said at the beginning of the video, roughly around 7,000 feet, didn't I? they're going to take about 3 minutes to crash from 7,000 feet, which in itself is an indicator. We're not in a doomed plane, because a doomed plane means a plane that's completely stalled or in a steep dive or something like that. It often exceeds 10,000 feet per minute, with many examples on this channel. We usually have over 10,000 feet per minute on the variometer, and at that time it was 7,000 feet. As you can see, you cover it in 40 seconds, 45 seconds, you've already hit it. So the fact that he took 3 minutes there, we're talking about a descent rate slightly above 2,000 feet per minute, which isn't an unusual descent rate. In any airliner outside of approach, 2,000 feet per minute is pretty normal, but the plane still ended up hitting. He thinks the pilots were overwhelmed, maybe by the smoke that entered the cockpit. Potentially because it seems like it, but again, they can't confirm it. Based on the voice signature, it seems that at least during the last message, the person speaking to air traffic control was wearing an oxygen mask. So maybe they put on an oxygen mask, which is consistent with the fact that they reported a fire, but the oxygen mask won't protect against every situation. So it's possible that they were either blinded by very thick smoke or also poisoned by smoke despite the mask. Many possibilities like this are being decided now. Subtitling. They're going to say in the report that probably there was a fire that broke out in the restroom on the right in the back, because that's where the epicenter seems to be. So fire declaration. What? At that time, people smoked a lot on planes. It was allowed to smoke in the 90s. People smoked on planes. So people were smoking. Someone maybe went to the bathroom and threw a cigarette butt in there. It happened before this accident. It happened after this accident, right? A few years later, there was a Boeing 707 that landed. It was flying from Rio to Paris, and it landed in a field, all because of a fire. Unfortunately, most of the passengers died. Over 120 people died in this incident, once again due to a cigarette butt. Because back then, smoking everywhere at any time was practically considered a fundamental human right. So, as I was saying, that's what they think about. Or maybe they're also thinking about an electric water heater. A water heater, right, that has a heating element. In the past, a plane was destroyed on the ground because of this. That there's a runaway inside that system, that the circuit breaker doesn't realize there's a problem. It keeps supplying electricity, and then after that, the whole thing catches fire. So the investigation commission analyzed other options. For example, they looked at the linings. You know, especially the foam. How do you say it in English? In French, it's mousse, the foam making up the seat backs and seats. They took this foam and they did x-rays. So there are 310 x-rays. So it's a medical x-ray, literally. So with the x-ray, one by one, they're numbered. So we do the x-ray and we want to see what's inside. Why? Because when there's an explosion, like for example, a bomb, right? Well, there are metal fragments that end up in the foam. So they're projected and they stay in the foam. X-rays let you see them in the foam. They'll see plastic objects, glass, all that, but they won't. A characteristic signature of an explosion. Why? Because in explosions, there are pieces of metal in the foam, but these pieces of metal wouldn't be, in the case of an explosion, once again placed randomly. That matches, because if I take this room, for example, we put cushions everywhere and set off an explosion, we detonate something. The pieces of metal wouldn't be randomly placed in the cushions, but they would all have an orientation that converges toward a central point, toward the center of the explosion. So the distance between them, the angle at which they entered the foam, actually matches. It gives an idea of an explosion. In this specific case, we don't have that. They're also considering the missile theory. They're wondering if a missile hit. It's a possibility, so they rule it out based on the fact that actually around 2 times. First, that we partially rescue them on site when helicopters, frigates, all that was sent to the site to explore a bit, to try to see what happened. Well, they didn't see any soldiers playing around with missiles. That's the first point. Secondly, they say that on the radar, there were no traces of missiles. That being said, once again, considering the radar's sweep and the speed of the missiles, which can go several times the speed of sound, well, the radar can potentially sweep the plane by the time the antenna makes a turn and comes back, especially with the radars of that time. The missile has already appeared, has already hit the plane, so the fact that they don't see it on the radar itself, right, doesn't allow us to exclude the missile theory, especially since it seems there are some secrets. For example, there was a French Navy ship called the Suffren, and apparently pages corresponding to September 11, there's one that was torn out, then others that were tampered with using a pen with glue, all that. So that when you look at it, it seems obvious. There are clear signs of tampering, especially since even if you look at the modern history of missiles and planes, it's not something completely unusual. It's not like it's crazy. It just came out of nowhere. If you look at the 777, the NH-18 from Malaysia, well, it was shot down by a book over Ukraine several years ago, possibly in 2014, and more recently, around 2020, roughly speaking, when the Iranian forces shot down a Boeing 737-800 belonging to a Ukrainian civilian airline. It was on the Tehran-Kiev flight. It had just taken off. It took off and was hit by a missile. Here, we're talking roughly about nearly 200 deaths. Still, in this story, we also have the United States ship Vincennes at one point in 88, the United States ship Vincennes, an American ship that was in the Gulf, fired at an Iranian Airbus A300. All right, and well, everyone died. I think there were 298 deaths at that time. We had 2015 too. Over the Sinai, there was a Thompson flyplane that came from the United Kingdom, went to Sinai and went to Sharm el-Sheikh. Isn't it a seaside resort? Well, the pilot had to avoid a missile. He had to make an evasive maneuver from a missile because apparently a missile came within less than 300 meters of the plane. So afterwards, the Egyptians said, listen, it was just a training exercise. You weren't targeted. It's nothing personal. I mean, it wasn't meant for you. No one tried to lock onto you with a missile or anything. It was just launched as part of an exercise. You were there. It was more a scare than anything. So if we look at the history of Egypt, for example, with public transportation accidents, whether it's trains, planes, ferries, all of that, we realize that they are always extremely covered up regarding the reasons, regarding the malfunctions that led to the accident. That led, as in this case, to the incident, which is extremely serious. Also, having a civilian plane and a missile together is extremely serious. In any case, just to tell you that it seems today we are trying to confirm or refute, isn't it, the missile theory, and that we will have to look for chemical records. Nor after such a long time, almost 60 years after the event. I don't think it could reveal anything though. But there's still the rest, 3/4 of the plane that's underwater. And by bringing them up, maybe they'll finally be able to give the families some reasons, some answers. I almost want to say to start their grieving process, because right now the problem is that many of the victims' families are deeply affected by this and don't have any answers. Indeed, it's true that it creates obstacles that sometimes prevent people from closing or even starting their grieving process, doesn't it? So there's this search for the truth, which is completely respectable. Other elements in the report, in my opinion, still haven't been explored. In my opinion, those elements haven't been given the attention they deserve, especially since they appear numerous times in the official accident report. It was decided that bullets were found 5mm cartridges, 5.5mm. So that's it. It's the .22 caliber. And we also found cartridges and bullets of 9mm. So isn't that at least 2 weapons? We have 2 weapons on the plane. Some bullets were fired. It's in the report. That's not from me. Some bullets were fired and actually fired in the direction with the heat. They exploded, didn't they? We found, for example, near the well-known restroom at the back right, where the fire apparently started. Well, it seems that there's a panel with a 5.5mm hole, a very clean hole. So there, it's a bullet that went through. There's another place as well where we'll also find a 5.5 millimeter metal ball. So when they analyzed this with the ballistics lab, they discovered that this arsenal was most likely in the restroom where the fire started. All right, it's hidden somewhere afterwards. These bullets weren't fired through a barrel, but by the heat, right? Well, they exploded and then they go off, of course, but with extremely low force. It can still hit a plastic partition or a wall with honeycomb inside and all that, but it doesn't go any further now. Today, when we look at this report, it feels like this story has been brushed aside a little bit. That means they're saying we did ballistic tests. Tests show it wasn't fired through a barrel, so it couldn't be linked to the accident. Goodbye, nothing to see here. There's no logical connection. It means that when we look at how the investigation committee erases or dismisses these elements, we don't see any logical connection. It feels like it was dismissed rather superficially, to be honest with you. So what can we say about this? We can say that in what we reported, in the 25 of what we reported, we have already found bullet impacts, we have already found bullets, we have already found 2 types of weapons already. So God knows what we would have found if we had had access to everything. Isn't it from the wreckage and the serasms? All right, so just to let you know, we have 2 weapons. The 5.5, it's probably even more improvised. That means that when they took the cartridge, they brought it to the company that made those cartridges. They said, this basically comes from us. But the metal ball, that's not us. Someone put the metal ball on the cartridge. So obviously we're dealing with something amateur, something homemade. We're talking about small caliber, .22 with some tinkering and all that. So we're probably dealing with weapons that were hidden. We're probably dealing with weapons that were brought in, right? According to the report, people hid in the bathrooms, possibly for a hijacking or another reason. It was the golden age of hijackings, though hijacking a plane on just a 20-minute flight seems odd. But anyway, still, you have to consider it. You also have to say that hijackers aren't always the smartest. So now, there's also the 9mm. Here, we're talking about real caliber. We're talking about a pretty serious caliber. We're talking about law enforcement caliber, etc. So we're just wondering if there wasn't some shooting inside the plane. Notwithstanding the fact that some bullets from the arsenal on board burned and exploded on their own like popcorn. I get it, that's fine. I'm not questioning that, but I wonder if there weren't others as well. Weren't there some that were fired? Because you have to understand that it's a flight that crashed after all. So we're saying to ourselves, okay, a flight crashes, we have evidence of shooting, we have evidence of weapons, everything. Then, well, no, that's not it. We're going to look for a golden missile. You see what I mean? I'm quite surprised that these weapons didn't get the attention they deserved. So we can imagine, for example, people who bring things in or hide them, or who make others hide them in the bathroom. Homemade weapons like Type 22 weapons, right? With metal bullets and everything, all with the goal of hijacking the plane, which was pretty much the practice at the time. And then when they actually want to start the hijacking phase, remember, they don't have much time. It's a very short flight. Well, at that moment, one of the responders is facing them. So, for example, armed police officers, armed soldiers, we know there was at least one general there on the plane. So let's imagine there are armed soldiers or police officers, and then there's a response, shots are fired, for example, and then we could end up, for example, with a shredded fuel hose. Isn't it torn? Bad luck. And then it goes through a partition, and then we have fuel spraying inside, we have fire and everything. And then, isn't that all the escalation? So it's something that seems to me we can't just rule it out just like that. We have an accident, we have weapons, and in particular, the weapons are in the area where there was the fire. So we also wonder if, for example, besides bringing up, weren't these weapons homemade weapons? A22 and everything, if these same responders didn't bring them up. Also, for example, incendiary devices or others that they might have wanted to use to threaten, right? And then, well, in the heat of the moment, isn't that it? It went off and it really caught fire and everything. And maybe it's not even a matter of fuel. Maybe it's just a matter of an incendiary device, a shooting, all that. And then it caused the accident I'm telling you about, you see? So those are possibilities. But will we ever be able to answer the question, will we ever know if it was a missile that was accidentally fired by the French army? Wasn't it during a test or training exercise? Then it hit the passenger plane and they tried to cover it up. Why not? Totally possible. The Iranians, when the 737 was shot down, they initially denied responsibility, saying it wasn't them. Tensions are high, but the region is always tense. That's it. It's a possibility. Of course, it's a possibility. The people responsible are dead, the spirits, and we're in a shadow theater. Today, we can't find anyone. Everyone from that time is more or less dead. Look, the ministers, generals, and key figures who could have hidden this. They're no longer with us today, so it's very hard to fully trace this back now. What I hope is that by actually investigating what's underwater, maybe we can find something new, one way or another. In any case, the fire theory is interesting. But knowing that the flight stayed roughly 5 to 6 minutes at cruising altitude, that's the only time when the fasten your seatbelt sign wasn't on. So that's the only time when the passengers could move around. So can we imagine that someone very quickly during this phase at level 160 goes to the restroom? He wants to smoke. You see him just waiting for us to leave. As soon as we arrive, bam, he heads to the restroom to smoke. Back then, he could smoke at his seat without any issue. No need to go to the restroom. But anyway, let's say he wanted to go to the restroom and smoke a cigar. There you go, you know what I mean. He comes in, smokes in the restroom, throws the cigarette in the trash bin, in the bin with the paper towels. For him to throw it in there, for him to be really irresponsible. And then, well, there are irresponsible people out there, right? So he goes back to his seat afterwards, fasten your seatbelts. Now there's a fire smoldering in the restroom, but since no one goes to the restroom, no one goes because the fasten seatbelt sign is on. Well, we're going to miss the chance. We're going to miss the chance to detect the fire because otherwise, in another situation, the fire could have been, detected visually at a time when it would still have been possible to put it out. One last failure. To finish, because it's a fascinating story, I'll tell you the story of this Ajaccio-Nice flight. We could discuss this for hours, but let's focus on just one disturbing detail from the story. When they found the fire extinguishers, they picked them up underwater, they were still attached to the wall where they normally are. What does that mean? It means that we didn't have the chance to use them. And besides, the investigation report says, but why didn't they use them? They don't understand. So they say either the fire broke out too quickly, maybe a missile in that case, or that the smoke was too thick. All of a sudden, it's hard to imagine smoke suddenly getting so thick you can't reach the fire extinguisher. Maybe the passengers were just fleeing. The area where the fire is, where the smoke is, will prevent the crew from actually getting to the part where the fire is. Another possibility, or maybe since there's a shooting, people are more focused on hiding than going for the fire extinguishers. That's another possibility. Not all bodies have been recovered yet, so autopsies, x-rays, or other procedures can't be done. And say, we found a bullet in this one or that one. Unfortunately, it's not completely possible to investigate this way since the majority of the bodies, or at least a good part of them, haven't been able to be recovered. So there you go, my friends. I know I'm leaving you with more questions than answers. And actually, that's the very reason why the investigation was reopened. Even though 60 years later, the justice system says it's time to put an end to this. We're going to see what we can find because there are too many unanswered questions. Once again, anyway, my friends, thank you for watching this video up to this point. The next videos will be published exclusively on Patreon. I'm giving you the Patreon link for those who support this channel. I will come from time to time, especially for the news. But the other videos outside of the news, starting today, will be published on Patreon and they will never be uploaded to YouTube. I think that's one, I have to take this action because it's the only way to ensure the sustainability of this channel. Otherwise, if I start posting everything on YouTube, maybe I'll explain it to you another time. In detail, I see that this channel won't be able to survive beyond 6 to 12 months. The ratio between the work it generates, the investigative work it generates, compared to the YouTube revenue it generates, well, it's a ratio that's completely unbalanced and doesn't allow in the long term for the continuity of this channel. In any case, thanks again to those who have supported this channel on YouTube from the very beginning, sometimes without necessarily having any exclusivity. And then we'll see each other again in a future video at some point. Thank you and see you soon.